Bobby Kennedy was dating her sister. Not a footnote. Not a brief thing before he noticed the right one. He courted Pat Skakel for the better part of 2 years, and Ethel was the loud younger sister in the room the whole time, organizing the games, telling the jokes, waiting. America never heard that version. What America got was the kneeling widow on a hotel kitchen floor in June 1968, and a woman who spent the next 56 years being introduced as the most devoted wife in American politics. She was devoted. That part is true, and it is the least interesting thing about her. She was also his most consistent advocate for the race that ended in that hotel kitchen. She cut off the family she came from and barely spoke of them again. And when it was over, the National Archives handed a grieving widow control of her dead husband's papers, and historians spent 4 decades asking her permission. Start with a ski trip in December 1945. Mont Tremblant, Quebec. Jean Kennedy brought her college roommate on a family holiday, and the roommate was a 17-year-old named Ethel Skakel. Her brother Bobby came too, and he barely registered her. There was a reason, and it shapes the whole story. He was involved with Pat, the older Skakel sister, the prettier one by the accounts of the period, and certainly the calmer one. For roughly 2 years, Bobby Kennedy went out with one sister, while the other made herself impossible to overlook and easy to overlook at the same time. Park that detail. It explains a woman who spent 50 years trying to be more Kennedy than the Kennedys, and you do not try that hard if you were the first choice. Now, what she was actually leaving. The Skakels had more money than the Kennedys, and about 1/10 of the control. Her father started as a railroad clerk on $8 a week and built Great Lakes Carbon into one of the largest privately held companies in America. In 1936, he installed 7 children in a 31-room house in Greenwich, Connecticut. Biographers who talked to the neighbors decades later came back with the same picture from different doors. Guns in the house, wrecked cars, serious drinking. Her father kept his distance from the church. Her mother Anne was ferociously Catholic and drilled it into the daughters, and the girl absorbed 2 rules that never came off. God is not up for discussion. Family embarrassments are not either. Everything she did for the next 70 years runs on those 2 rules. That family generated plenty that needed not discussing. Her father died in a plane crash in 1955. Her brother George died in another one 11 years later. Decades on, a nephew would stand trial in one of the most notorious murder cases in the country. Almost none of it ever entered Ethel Kennedy's public story. She learned it in a 31-room house full of secrets. You do not explain your family, you outrun it. Her courtship of Bobby Kennedy was not a courtship. It was a campaign, and she ran it. Follow the dates, because they do not sit where the romance version puts them. In 1946, while he was still half attached to her sister, she rang doorbells in Boston for Jack Kennedy's first congressional race. For a family she had not joined. At Manhattanville, she wrote her senior thesis on Jack's book, Why England Slept. Say that out loud. She wrote her college thesis on a book by the brother of the man her sister was dating. A hostile 1994 biography claims her first interest was actually Jack himself. That rests on unnamed friends and belongs in the pile of things nobody can check. What is documented is enough. Before there was any proposal, Ethel Skakel had studied that family the way other students study for finals. Bobby got something out of it too. He was the 7th child, small for a Kennedy, permanently in the shadow of a dead older brother and a charming older one. Here was a girl who believed in him with a ferocity nobody else was offering before he had done anything worth believing in. That devotion was real. It was also her entry fee. The courtship carried warnings if anybody had wanted to read them. He was awkward and slow about it. Friends recalled a suitor so hesitant that her convent idea resurfaced mid-relationship, and she is said to have joked that her competition was not another girl, but God. Whatever that story has picked up in the retelling, the shape is clear. This was not a man swept away. This was a man deciding that the loud Skakel girl who adored him fitted the life his family required. They got engaged in February 1950 and married on June 17th at St. Mary's in Greenwich. The Boston Globe printed the quiet part. The marriage, it said, united two large fortunes. The wedding previews the next 40 years with almost unkind precision. On the Kennedy side, choreography and political usefulness. Jack was best man and worked the reception like a stop on a schedule. On the Skakel side, her brothers turned it into a demolition derby of drunken pranks that mortified the bride. She was marrying out of one chaotic dynasty into a colder and better organized one, and the organized one watched her relatives with open contempt. Ask how much, and the record answers sideways. Jerry Oppenheimer's 1994 biography, unauthorized and hostile and built on hundreds of interviews, attributes a line to Bobby about his in-laws, that if he were not married to Ethel, he would not give those people the time of day. Weigh that accordingly. It is a hostile book, and the quote has no second source, but you do not need the quote. Her behavior said it for her. From the early 1950s onward, she oriented her entire existence toward Hyannisport and away from Greenwich. Oppenheimer's sources say she effectively disowned the Skakels. Whatever you make of the wording, her family of birth simply stops appearing in her story. What replaced it was a system, and the system had conditions. 3 conditions, and she met all of them without being asked twice. The first was production. Rose Kennedy had 9 children. Ethel would have 11, roughly 1 every 18 months from 1951 to 1968, as though fertility were a scored event. In that family it was. The second was service. In 1952, the young couple moved into a Boston rooming house so Bobby could run Jack's Senate campaign against Henry Cabot Lodge, and Ethel, pregnant, organized the tea parties that put the candidate in front of thousands of women voters. Those receptions were filmed by the newsreels, rooms of women in hats queuing around the block in Worcester and in Springfield, and the woman running the logistics is in none of the captions. The third was precedence. Her husband belonged to the family before he belonged to her, and her job was to keep a household running while the men were somewhere else. She did not resist a single part of it. She excelled at it, loudly, in a way some of the in-laws found exhausting. The nickname that came back around the family circle was that she was more Kennedy than the Kennedys. Consider what a compliment like that actually contains. Now watch the hierarchy at the compound, because Hyannisport was where the family kept its actual power. Old Joe set the schedules and the priorities. Rose set the religious tone. The brothers competed at everything, and the wives were graded, informally and unmistakably, on enthusiasm and output. Ethel thrived exactly where Jackie visibly suffered. She threw herself into the games. She learned the jokes. She matched Rose prayer for prayer and produced grandchildren at a rate that delighted her father-in-law. What it cost her is visible in what she did not have. No identity that world had not issued, no corner of it that was hers, and no way back. Jackie could retreat into books and Paris. Joan had music. Ethel had burned the road to Greenwich herself. By 1955, the Kennedys were not her in-laws. They were the entire structure she was standing on. Then, in one afternoon, the family she had been quietly leaving was destroyed. Stop on the date because of what she did with it. On October 3, 1955, months after she delivered her 4th child, her parents' private plane went down near Union City, Oklahoma. Both were killed. This is the moment the marriage shows you its actual shape. There was no long public mourning, no visible turn back toward Greenwich. Friends described a grief that was intense and almost entirely private, sealed off exactly the way her mother had taught her. Within a year, she and Bobby were buying Hickory Hill, the 13-bedroom estate in Virginia, from Jack and Jackie, who were letting it go after Jackie's stillbirth. Sit with that transaction for a moment. She took the house where her sister-in-law's hopes had collapsed and turned it into the loudest address in Washington. Orphaned by the family she had distanced, doubling down on the family that tolerated her. Hickory Hill is where the myth got manufactured, and I want to give it its due. It was an excellent product. Newspapers showed America a glorious circus, 11 children, horses, dogs, and at one point a sea lion, touch football on the lawn, parties where fully dressed guests ended up in the pool, and in 1962, the historian Arthur Schlesinger went in wearing his suit, and Washington talked about it for weeks. She was cast as the anti-Jackie, unpretentious, fun, fertile, devout. Voters loved it, the family loved it, and reporters loved being invited. Now look behind it. Count the hours the man of the house was actually in the house. From 1957, the McClellan hearings ran on national television day after day, with Robert Kennedy taking Jimmy Hoffa apart in front of the cameras. Then the 1960 campaign, the inauguration, the Justice Department, the missile crisis. Every one of those is a week he was not at Hickory Hill. Ethel ran an estate of 12 children and rotating staff essentially alone, pregnant for most of it. The famous chaos read as joy in photographs. Day to day, according to people who worked there, it ran closer to an unmanned ship. The harder accounts come through that same hostile 1994 book, so hold them loosely. Unpaid bills, a revolving door of governesses, a mistress of the house who could be generous 1 hour and volcanic the next. The arithmetic is not in dispute. Between 1951 and 1968, she was pregnant 11 times, buried both parents and a brother, ran a 13-bedroom estate, and hosted the most socially demanding household in Washington, while her husband belonged in every meaningful hour to his brother's administration. The legend says he made it home for dinner. Sometimes he did. It does not mention how often dinner was the entire appearance. Then Dallas. November 1963 did not only kill a president. Follow what it did to the man she had built her life around. The state funeral that November drew the largest television audience in American history to that point. The riderless horse, the cathedral, the salute on the steps. Ethel is in that footage, standing in the second rank, and almost nobody has ever looked for her in it. Afterwards, Bobby fell into a depression his biographers describe without softening it. Gaunt, withdrawn, wearing his dead brother's coat, gone for the better part of a year. There is a private wound inside that public tragedy. The person who could reach him in the dark was not always his wife. Contemporary accounts describe Bobby and the widowed Jackie bound together in mourning, while Ethel, whose faith made grief almost a theological error since Jack was surely in heaven, kept the household loud and the sorrow off limits. She responded the only way she ever had. Activity, more children, and a relentless push to get him moving again. Her husband is broken, and the person reaching him is his brother's widow. People around both women described a rivalry underneath that year, secondhand and late. Ethel is said to have mocked Jackie's breathy voice while privately smarting that Jackie had got the White House. Unverifiable. The structure underneath it is not. That family had one crown, and the woman who had given up the most to belong was never going to wear it. When he ran for the Senate from New York in 1964, she campaigned pregnant, and the machine restarted. The motorcades through Brooklyn and Buffalo that autumn were filmed from the press bus for 6 weeks straight. Now the decision, and it is the most uncomfortable documented fact in her life. The 1968 campaign was substantially her doing. Bobby agonized for months over challenging a sitting president. His advisors split. His brother Ted urged caution. Ethel pushed. Evan Thomas, who is not a sensationalist and who worked from archives and hundreds of interviews, called her Bobby's most consistent advocate of a run for the White House. She teased him for hesitating. She invoked his dead brother. Two things drove that at once, and I do not think you can separate them. She believed he was the best hope the country had, and Jackie's husband had worn the crown that never came to her. On March 16, 1968, he declared in the Senate caucus room, the same room where his brother had declared 8 years earlier. It was carried live. Ethel, pregnant with their 11th child, went out on the trail beside him. For a few months, the marriage was what the myth had always claimed it was. Two people fused into one purpose, visibly happy and visibly effective. One night from that campaign is worth keeping. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and Bobby, against police advice, climbed onto a flatbed truck in Indianapolis and delivered, unscripted, one of the great speeches in American history. Ethel was on that trip, visibly pregnant. The crowds those weeks reached for both of them, and her wedding ring was reportedly torn off more than once in the crush. After 17 years of waiting rooms, she was standing where the history was happening. If you want to understand why she stayed through everything, look at the spring of 1968. That partnership was real, and it was the payoff. It lasted 11 weeks. Count them from the declaration, because the campaign that made her happiest is also the one she talked him into. On June 4th, he won the California primary and came down to the embassy ballroom to claim it in front of the cameras. That victory speech was broadcast live and exists in full. What happened 90 seconds later, in a service corridor behind the ballroom, does not. Ethel was 3 months pregnant and steps behind him. There is a detail from that same day that almost nobody includes. That afternoon at Malibu, Bobby had pulled their 12-year-old son David out of a dangerous undertow. Hours later, upstairs at the hotel, David watched his father's shooting live on television, alone. He died the next day. 6 months later, on December 12th, she gave birth to a daughter whose father had been dead half a year. The Requiem Mass at St. Patrick's on June 8th was carried by all 3 networks. Then the funeral train went south, and 2 million people lined the tracks between New York and Washington, while photographers shot the crowds from the windows for 8 hours. Ethel walked the length of those cars, thanking supporters one at a time. It was genuinely brave, and I do not want that read as cynicism. It was also the moment she took over the family business of grief. America expected the widow to disappear into black. What happened instead was harder and stranger. In the months after, she built something. She helped establish the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial and installed herself as the permanent keeper of his causes. In public, she was magnificent. What happened privately needs sorting into 3 piles. Documented first. She refused, essentially forever, to speak about the assassination, not to reporters, and far more consequentially, not to her children. Her sons told interviewers, including the biographers Peter Collier and David Horowitz, that their father's death was simply not discussable at home. Reported second. People who worked there described chronic staff turnover and a household running without a hand on it. Consistent across sources, but recollections given years later. Contested third. Oppenheimer's unnamed sources said employees called the estate Horror Hill and described rages. That is an allegation from an unauthorized book with no named witness, and it should be carried as nothing more. Outside all 3 piles sits the arithmetic. The older boys came apart. David died in Palm Beach in April 1984 at 28. Michael died in a skiing accident in 1997. She buried 2 sons the way she had buried her parents, her brother, and her husband, publicly composed, privately sealed. And inside the family, the second-choice sister-in-law quietly became the center of gravity. With Jack and Bobby gone, her 11 children made her household the dynasty's future, and her approval started to matter in a way it never had while her husband was alive. Count the years on this next part. She never remarried. 56 of them. In 1991, she gave People magazine the line that defined her second act. Remarrying, she said, would be adultery. How could she, with Bobby looking down? You can hear that as devotion. You can also hear it as the final form of a deal she made in 1950. She had traded her identity for a name, and widowhood was the last office that name would ever give her. And while the country was busy pitying her, something else was happening that took 40 years to become visible. After the assassination, the National Archives agreed to something extraordinary. It let Ethel Kennedy take control of her husband's papers. Not the government. The widow. For more than 4 decades, dozens of boxes covering his years at the center of American power sat at the Kennedy Library under family control. Historians who wanted them had to ask her. Many asked, most waited, and scholars complained publicly that the fullest record of Robert Kennedy was held by the person most invested in one version of it. Access came selectively. Arthur Schlesinger, the same friend who had gone into the pool in his suit, was granted the papers for his affectionate 1978 biography. Writers the family trusted got in. Writers it did not trust waited, and every waiting year hardened the love story version into settled history. Substantial releases only began around 2012, and the family's fingerprints were on the process even then. The woman remembered as the passive half of a great man's story spent half a century as the gatekeeper of that story's evidence. She curated the softer channels, too. The definitive film about her life, the 2012 documentary Ethel, was made by her own daughter Rory, the child born after the assassination, on Ethel's terms. When the conversation approaches June 1968, the 83-year-old waves the subject away on camera. The refusal made the final cut. The silence was the portrait. In November 2014, at a televised ceremony in the East Room of the White House, President Obama put the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck. She was 86, and she is smiling in every frame of it. She died in Boston in October 2024 at 96. 3 presidents eulogized her, and the funeral was covered nationally. December 1945. A 17-year-old at Mont Tremblant, on a holiday with a family she has not joined, watching a boy who is dating her sister. That is where she started. She never stopped being the second choice, and she seems to have known it. Jackie got the White House, the magazine covers, and the mystique. Rose got the papal title. Joan got sympathy. Ethel, who sacrificed more than any of them to belong, was never going to wear the crown. So look at what she took instead. She was not given the archive. Nobody in that family voted to hand it to her, and no institution was obliged to. She asked, at the exact moment when nobody in America could refuse a woman who had knelt on that floor, and she never let go of it again. For 40 years, every historian who wanted to know what that marriage had actually been like had to write to Hickory Hill and wait. Most of them are still waiting. There are streets named after Bobby Kennedy, and an airport, and a stadium, and a federal building. There is no version of that marriage on any shelf anywhere that she did not approve.